This is a critique of the proposed eighth principle of Unitarian Universalism. This critique was created in February of 2022. This critique has 5 sections. Section 1 is the introduction, where I explain why this critique was created. I show a time estimate on the right for each section here. In section 2, I offer interpretations of the proposed eighth principle referring to official UUA writings. In section 3, I examine current trends in UU national institutions. This is background context that's essential for understanding why some UU members are hesitant to adopt the proposed eighth principle. Section 4 will look at changes in UU that are already happening or are poised to be proposed in the next 2 years. This also provides essential context for understanding how the eighth principle fits into a bigger picture. And in section 5, I will come to a conclusion. The proposed eighth principle of Unitarian Universalism appears to have very strong popular support from UU members. UU members are inspired by its goal of greater inclusion of members of historically marginalized identity groups. UU members welcome a strong emphasis on fighting against racism and oppression of marginalized groups. UU members are responding to the call to elevate the voices of the marginalized. They eagerly look forward to a future where all members equally benefit from the promise of spiritual wholeness in UU. These are goals everyone supports. However, many UU members believe that the meaning and intent of the proposed eighth principle is underestimated and should be discussed more deeply and openly before each congregation decides whether to adopt the proposed eighth principle. The words in the proposed eighth principle are ambiguous. Ask yourself, are you clear about what accountably means? Accountable to who? Are you clear about the definition of racism? Are you clear about what constitutes oppressions and what causes them? What does dismantle mean? Who decides what actions are sufficient? Why is the focus on ourselves and our institutions, not America as a whole? Why does it use the phrase beloved community? Is specifically mentioning diverse multicultural, signaling that inclusion is one of the main goals? And what is meant when UU leadership refers to white supremacy culture? Some UU members are frustrated with a tendency to obsess over each and every word. They want to focus on the spirit of the principle, not get hung up on how it's worded. But if UU members are going to make a commitment to be accountable for acting to achieve its goals, it is important that the meaning and intent of every phrase is clearly interpreted and all UU members come to a shared understanding of what it means. Whose interpretations matter? Where does the authority to define these words really lie? Can individual congregations even answer questions about the meaning of each phrase in the proposed eighth principle? If the future of UU is more interdependence, less congregational autonomy, what each congregation thinks the proposed eighth principle means probably does not matter. These clarifications would have to come from higher up in the UU national hierarchy. Most of the interpretations I offer come from looking at official UUA writings. I am describing how the proposed eighth principle will be interpreted and enforced if authority lies with national UUA institutions. A quick comment about style. I anticipate that the viewer will frequently be thinking, how do you know that? Or why should I believe what's being asserted here? In almost all cases, a justification for an assertion will be offered by pointing to official UUA writings. Snapshots of a pertinent section in a source document will be shown alongside the commentary on each page. Now, I'm not going to read the excerpts. That takes too much time. But if the viewer is interested in reading the source documents, they can pause the video playback. The URLs to the source documents are shown at the bottom of each page, and a recap of all references is repeated at the end of the presentation. I start by asking, what does the proposed eighth principle mean? And the first word I want to focus on is actions. Including the word actions reveals that the proposed eighth principle is unusual. But contrary to comments we hear many UU members make, this principle is not redundant. Principles number 1 through 7 are aspirational, lighting a path for us to be our best selves, both individually and collectively. This principle has a different tone, being more of a must-do mandate than a should-do aspiration. The whole point of the proposed eighth principle is to mandate action and to hold us accountable for that. Accountable action is what makes this principle unique and thus not redundant. I'm going to spend more time on the interpretation of oppressions than any other word. I believe it is the core to this principle, so it's essential to understand how to interpret it. The concept of oppressions in the proposed eighth principle is derived from critical race theory. Critical race theory says that disparities in American society are due to American culture, preserving power and privilege for the racial identity group in power, which means it preserves power and privilege for white citizens. Critical race theory asserts that American, i.e. white culture, oppresses all other racial identity groups. Critical race theory's analysis of power structures is a specific application of what are called critical theories, or just plain theory. Critical race theory is based on more than just a dissection of power structures. To understand the definition of oppressions in the proposed eighth principle and to understand other current trends in UU, we need to look more deeply at 3 more foundations of critical race theory: positionality, intersectionality, and postmodernism. Positionality points out that each identity group has a unique perspective of the world. This is called standpoint theory by some people. Intersectionality points out that everyone belongs to more than one identity group, and each intersection of identities also has a unique perspective of the world. Postmodernism posits that there is no objective truth or objective reality. Cultures have different norms about what kinds of knowledge count. Norms are subjective and perhaps arbitrary. This can be summed up as those affected know best, or those not affected cannot know better than those affected. Framed another way, those with lived experience know better than those without the lived experience. This is postmodern because it explicitly says that modern ways of knowing, like reason and logic, are not better ways of knowing. Requiring evidence to prove assertions also assumes that unaffected groups can sometimes discern what is true and real better than affected persons or groups. Due process is sometimes used as a tool for overriding the knowledge of affected persons or groups. Now we merge positionality and intersectionality and postmodernism with critical race theory's dissection of power structures, where critical race theory says norms about what counts as knowledge are just an exercise in power. By privileging their ways of knowing, American culture, i.e. white culture, has successfully preserved their privilege and power. Postmodernism asserts that knowledge is subjective. So white culture's ways of knowing are arbitrary tools for oppressing non-dominant identity groups. To eliminate oppression, other ways of knowing must be elevated over white ways of knowing. The same logic applies to white culture's ways of doing and white culture's ways of being. Critical race theory says they are oppressive because they work to the advantage of the dominant racial identity groups. So, white culture's ways of doing are asserted to be tools of oppression. Critical race theory offers a diagnosis of the problem of oppression. Oppression is caused by oppressive power sustained by privileging white ways of knowing, doing, and being. Critical race theory also offers a solution to oppression. Oppression can be solved by elevating the oppressed group's ways of knowing, doing, and being above the dominant norms. Most social scientists disagree with that diagnosis. Critical race theory has a thought-provoking insight, but describes only one of many complex factors that result in disparate outcomes for racial groups in America. Postmodernism's relativism is even more controversial. Just because objectivity is elusive does not mean we should abandon reason and logic and the value of evidence. Objectivity is still a worthwhile goal. One paradox is that lived experience can attest to what happened to you, but is less reliable at assessing why something happened to you. We need to get the best possible answers for both cause and effect. That's why we need both lived experience and reason and logic and evidence. Saying that the purpose of logic and reason and evidence is to oppress non-dominant identity groups is considered by most social scientists and political scientists to be a distortion of those theories. Critical race theory's framework that dissects power structures and norms about knowledge are also applicable to other identity groups. The dominant culture can manifest in oppressions due to gender, or due to sexual orientation, or due to disabilities, just to name the most obvious ones. The National UUA Board of Trustees refers to this broader application of critical race theory as white supremacy culture. The Commission on Institutional Change report titled Widening the Circle of Concern, which was presented at General Assembly in 2020, uses the exact phrase white supremacy culture 33 times. But here's the frustrating thing. The report does not define what it means by the phrase white supremacy culture. Widening the circle of concern does take one stab at defining oppression. The report states when we talk about power combined with prejudice and the centering of the dominant group, and now here's the important part, their ways of being and doing, we are talking about oppression. The word oppression is used over 200 times in the report, and in all other cases, they just use the word oppression as if it's obvious what it means. Let's talk about racism. In the context of the 8th principle, racism means disparate outcomes for non-white groups of people. Equality of opportunity is not considered good enough. Colorblindness alone is not sufficient. Equity in outcomes, especially for members of the non-dominant groups, is what the 8th principle mandates. Critical race theory appears to say that race is the deciding factor in American society. That is called race reductionism. Postmodernism plus positionality asserts that identity group membership determines your truths and your realities. Saying that your race is the most important thing about you is called race essentialism. Race reductionism says race defines America. Race essentialism says race defines you. The goal is not colorblindness. The goal is not seamless inclusion. Those goals of anti-racism efforts of the past 7 decades are rejected. The phrase "our institutions" means the target is all of UU itself. It assumes that all of UU manifests in racial and other oppressions of non-dominant identity groups. This diagnosis and mandate would be permanently embedded in the eternal UU principles. This implies that racism and other oppressions are going to be never-ending challenges for all UU members and all UU institutions. Dismantle means tear down or divest of power, what exists, and presumably replace or transform it, building something substantially different. The identity-based caucus, Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, BLUU, clearly interprets the goal of the proposed 8th principle as replacing UU's culture of prioritizing liberal Enlightenment values. This most likely will require rewriting many of the existing 7 principles to deprioritize UU's historical foundation of liberal Enlightenment values. Beloved community has many meanings. So does the related word covenant. Expressing a goal of beloved community in the proposed 8th principle is probably a call to change UU from being an association of independent congregations to being an interdependent denomination, centralizing authority into national UU institutions. Some UU leaders also use the word covenanting to imply that centralized authority is the desired future for UU. The mandate for the Task Force on Reinventing Covenanting, commissioned in 2015, was to change the culture of the National UU Association from one of Member Services Administration to one of mutual covenanting. What this kind of covenanting means is that individual congregations would no longer operate autonomously, independently deciding for themselves what to think or do. Let's talk about the word accountably. Who will we be accountable to? What will be the criteria we are judged by? UU member and congregation actions will be monitored by boards composed exclusively of members of historically marginalized identity groups. These will currently be representatives from primarily Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC, UU caucuses. If you can't centralize the enforcement of accountability, what is the point of centralizing authority? Let's bring back that one paragraph from the Task Force on Reimagining Covenant. It says, quote, require member congregations to renew their connection to the UUA every 2 years, with a statement on how they understand their community to be fulfilling UU purpose, end quote. That makes it pretty clear how the task force plan would enforce accountability. Since Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, BLUU, would have a prominent role, it is instructive to review their vision of accountability. Their wording is pretty stark. They say white UUs hold themselves accountable to communities of color to make sure whites do what they say they will do. That vision seems pretty clear. BIPOC, monitor whites. Here is another eye-opening interpretation of accountability in the same document. They say Black UUs hold each other accountable and help each other see and dismantle signs of internalized racism. It's interesting to look at how the COIC report defines internalized racism. It includes participating in a set of attitudes, behaviors, social structures, and ideologies that undergird the dominant group's power. This appears to agree with my interpretation of what oppressions and white supremacy culture really mean. Speaking of accountability, I want you to consider this. Every year, there are up to 3 action of immediate witness AIW statements voted on at General Assembly. These tend to be leading edge social justice issues. They list very specific actions to take. Almost all of these could be described as actions that dismantle racism and other oppressions in America and the world. AIWs are presented to the General Assembly, briefly debated, and then voted on in the span of a single GA. AIWs currently are not binding. If accountability is going to be enforced in the future, will AIWs be mandatory? Some of the AIWs over the past 4 years have had pretty aggressive goals that deserve a lot of deliberation, like calls to abolish ICE, the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, in 2018, or defunding the police and ICE in 2020, or decriminalizing sex work and defunding police in 2021. Will centralized accountability force congregations to actively support AIWs to remain in the UU? The primary impetus for creating an 8th principle was because the Journey Towards Wholeness campaign lost momentum. At General Assembly in 1997, the UUA made a commitment to becoming an anti-racist, multicultural organization. Later, a goal of being anti-oppression was added. The creators of the proposed 8th principle felt this is a commitment that remains unfulfilled because there was no accountability mechanism. The proposed 8th principle is intentionally worded to close that loophole. Many UU members support the proposed 8th principle because diverse, multicultural implies a goal of greater inclusion of people from historically marginalized identity groups. Readers of the COIC report might conclude that insufficient inclusion is UU's most pressing problem. So, why does UU need a new principle to be more diverse, equitable, and inclusive? UU already has a robust statement in Article 2 of the bylaws, making inclusion a very high priority. The existing 7 principles are full of aspirational words related to inclusion. So what is missing? The perceived missing piece was a diagnosis of the root cause of insufficient diversity, insufficient equity, and insufficient inclusion in Unitarian Universalism. The proposed 8th principle adopts the diagnosis and solution of critical race theory. The 8th principle diagnoses the root cause as being UU's culture, or to use the UUA board terminology, the root cause is white supremacy culture. The prescribed solution is to dismantle UU's culture. This means rejecting liberal Enlightenment values, including many in the existing 7 principles. The proposed 8th principle can be explained as a commitment made in 1997 remains unfulfilled. So the 8th principle will centralize authority in the UUA to replace the liberal values that are the foundation of UU, expecting this will achieve equal outcomes and greater inclusion of all historically marginalized identity groups. Those identity groups will make sure UU members and congregations prioritize this mandate and take effective actions to replace UU's culture. Now we will examine current trends in UU national institutions. This is background context that's essential for understanding why some UU members are hesitant to adopt the proposed eighth principle. You'll probably notice UU already being influenced by critical race's dissection of power, including the features of postmodernism and positionality and intersectionality and race reductionism and race essentialism. The first trend to understand is that UU culture is already being replaced. In 2017, the National UUA Board of Trustees abruptly accepted a characterization of Unitarian Universalism as having, quote, the realities of racism and white supremacy in our congregations, end quote. The UUA Board unilaterally committed to dismantling white supremacy culture throughout UU. UU congregations and institutions are being pressured to reject white liberal ways of knowing and doing things. They are supported when they abandon Enlightenment values like tolerance for multiple points of view. This is what dismantling white supremacy culture means. Personal lived experience of members of historically marginalized identity groups is being given higher priority than reason and logic and evidence. Logic and reason are rejected because they are white ways of knowing things. Disagreement is not tolerated if the opinions are contrary to the views of the non-dominant identity groups. When over 300 white UU ministers signed a letter condemning a book written by another UU minister, they equated disagreement with violence and harm. Ironically, most of these white UU ministers were disagreeing with a book that they had not yet read. The letter of condemnation came out just one day after the book was first distributed. After the author of that book was formally censured by the UUMA 2 months later, a letter was sent by 63 UU ministers to the UUMA board defending the right of ministers to offer ideas which challenge particular approaches to fighting oppression. Another current trend in UU, illuminated by that same episode, is that due process is often not followed by the UUMA Board of Trustees and the Ministerial Fellowship Committee. Evidence to support assertions of harm is no longer considered to be necessary because requiring evidence is a white way of knowing and doing things. Another important trend is that the individual is being devalued. The individual exercise of conscience is recast as a selfish individualism, one of the alleged trinity of errors in UU. Individualism is disparaged because deciding for yourself what to believe or do can slow down changes the UUA is promoting. Democracy is not being prioritized. Elections are manipulated to not be truly competitive. The Board of Trustees proposed making the UUA president election non-competitive, but that was actually voted down at GA in 2021. Efficiency and procedural norms like adhering to Robert's Rules of Order are disparaged, even though Robert's Rules is in the bylaws, because they are white ways of doing things. There has been greater encouragement to make identity-based caucuses a core component of the UU experience of members of historically marginalized identity groups. It is now unremarkable for separate identity-based rooms, virtual or real, to be set up during discussions of potentially contentious issues at General Assembly. There are clear benefits from safe spaces. but this appears to be trending towards what I would call balkanization. This promotes essentialism and could be very divisive. Unreasonable standards of conduct for UU ministers were added in 2020. These include a potential charge of tokenism for making any superficial gesture, however well-intentioned, to the principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, or sense by a member of the dominant group of fulfilling an ethical mandate, of just doing the right thing, or just trying to avoid criticism. Another unreasonable standard of conduct is the potential charge of bullying and abuse for opposing, which includes challenging another person's perceptions, opinions, and thoughts, or blocking, which includes switching topics or using words or other means to stop a conversation. When 13 long-serving UU ministers resigned as a group from the UUMA in September 2020, those newly implemented standards were two of the examples they gave for withdrawing their membership from the UUMA. In fact, that so-called "We Quit" letter describes the new ideology of UUA as a rejection of Enlightenment values. Those 13 ministers came to the same conclusion that this critique is putting forward. It is important to be aware of the point of view of all sides in this controversy. It is not just about one book. It is not just about one minister. The controversy about that one book and that one minister illuminates a deep ideological dispute that has engulfed UU over the past 5 years. Those 11 current trends in UU we just reviewed reflect the nature of this ideological rift. You can't really understand the proposed 8th principle without understanding the fundamentals of that ideological disagreement. There is one more trend in UU that deserves special attention. This is the concept of covenanting. Some UU leaders seem to be stretching the meaning of covenant. Covenant is only mentioned 3 times in the bylaws. First, to affirm and promote the 7 principles. Then wrapping up the principles section saying, as free congregations, we enter into this covenant promising to each other our mutual trust and support. And later to acknowledge that congregations might have their own covenants. Covenants are often beneficial, but sometimes they are used in bad faith, used as a weapon to shut down alternative points of view. That's not the point I want to make here. There's nothing equivalent to covenant between the congregations and the National Association. This is extremely frustrating to national leaders and some UU ministers. To try out a metaphor, they see the independent and autonomous congregations in the association as acting like a herd of cats. You just can't get them all lined up behind a mission that the national leaders aspire to accomplish. Some UU leaders imagine changing this relationship to be more like a team of horses, bound together, pulling together in a direction that the stagecoach driver knows is the right direction to go. When you hear UU leaders say we are a covenantal faith, what they are often trying to do is persuade the cats that they really are horses. This reimagining of covenant is a vision of the congregations giving up their independence and autonomy. This will only work if the national institutions are also given the authority to enforce accountability for acting on those missions. Now I want to switch gears slightly and examine changes in UU that are already happening or are poised to be proposed in the next 2 years. Examining these coming changes will also provide essential context for understanding how the proposed eighth principle fits into a bigger picture. Bylaw changes are being worked on that are expected to shift control away from the congregations to centralized authority, concentrating doctrine and policy-making power in national UUA institutions. The current plan as of February 2022 is to place a business resolution in front of the attendees of General Assembly in 2022. This resolution will ask for affirmation of a set of guidelines for revising the bylaws. The guidelines explicitly ask for the creation of new accountability mechanisms. These proposed guidelines also infer that a realignment of power is needed. The bylaw revisions would be expected to be proposed at General Assembly 1 year later in 2023. Hesitancy to support this concentration of power is often dismissed as an excessive focus on individualism and our allergy to authority and power. Stamping out individualism is not just about individuals. Insistence on congregational autonomy can be framed as individualism at the group level. A major rewrite of the existing 7 principles in Article 2 of the UUA bylaws will be proposed in 2023. The revisions will formally add the 8th principle at that time. At the very least, UU members should expect the concept of accountability and boundaries on individual prerogatives to be embedded in the other 7 principles. The 4th principle, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, appears to be a likely target for accountability and boundaries in the rewrite. The UUA board's vision for accountability will most likely be to make congregations answerable to boards composed exclusively of representatives of national UU caucuses of historically marginalized identity groups. That is what is recommended in the Widening the Circle of Concern report. The UUA Board of Trustees has already committed to pushing ahead and implementing the recommendations of the Commission on Institutional Change report titled Widening the Circle of Concern. At their September 2020 meeting, the board explained their justification for taking this initiative instead of waiting for UU congregations to debate the report. The board has a firm belief that, quote, systemic racism and white supremacy culture exist in many Unitarian Universalist institutions, end quote. Basically, the UUA Board of Trustees believes white supremacy culture in UU is an urgent crisis that needs a prompt and robust response immediately. So they are taking the initiative to make this happen. This expands the Board of Trustees' scope of active engagement beyond the missions found in the UUA bylaws, now involving the board in creating theological and governance policy. What should we conclude? What is your conclusion? Do you think my interpretations are just cherry picking unrepresentative sections from the Widening the Circle of Concern report? Do you think the examples of current trends in UU are just isolated incidents, not a new orthodoxy? I'm gonna flip around a comment I made near the beginning. I'm going to ask, why shouldn't we believe the recommendations of the Commission on Institutional Change report and the interpretations offered by Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism? How do you know that this critique is wrong? On the other hand, if these interpretations are concerning to you, if these trends are concerning to you, what should you conclude? What should you do? I will now offer a conclusion a recommended stance to take. Voting no on the proposed eighth principle is justifiable. Many UU members worry that if they vote no on the proposed eighth principle, it implies that they are not in favor of fighting against racism and oppression and not in favor of goals of effective inclusion of historically marginalized identity groups. But there is a middle ground. You can approve of most of the goals, but not this solution. A legitimate argument is that adopting the frameworks of critical race theory and postmodernism is the wrong direction to take. UU's prioritization of liberal enlightenment principles is not the root cause of the problem. It does not accurately explain why members of some identity groups feel UU is not diverse enough, equitable enough, nor inclusive enough. The diagnosis is wrong. Since the diagnosis is wrong, dismantling UU's historical foundation on liberal principles is the wrong answer. Critical race theory and postmodernism are distortions, yet they are being used to justify the rejection of reason and logic, and perhaps most pernicious of all, an intolerance of disagreement and alternative points of view. If we abandon those values, UU would no longer be UU. Many members have expressed a concern that this principle places too much focus on an internal issue, crowding out energy and attention for other urgent problems in America and the world. Equal outcomes are a subjective target. There are no definitive criteria for judging whether equal outcomes have been achieved. Equal outcomes, therefore, is an unrealistic goal. We should not commit to being held accountable for unrealistic goals that are judged with subjective criteria. Recent incidents of condemning expressions of disagreement from ministers demonstrates a rush to judgment and a disregard for due process. This recent pattern of intolerance towards ministers creates doubt about whether UU members will still be able to speak their mind without being unduly censored or censured. Some new standards of conduct for ministers are unreasonable. This trend of creating unreasonable codes of conduct creates doubt about whether judgments made by centralized bodies will be based on reasonable criteria. Centralizing authority is not the right direction. Expanded covenanting, if it means centralizing authority and centralized enforcement of accountability, is not the right direction. UU should remain an association of autonomous and independent congregations. We are not allergic to authority and power. We are wary of consolidated and centralized power. Recent unfair treatment of ministers makes us reluctant to place more control in the hands of UUA power centers. Being a UU member has never been about being compelled to think a specific way or act a specific way. A lack of an enforced dogma is what attracts many people to UU. Putting boundaries on a right to conscience or a free and responsible search for truth and meaning would deny them spiritual wholeness. If the only principle mandating action puts racism and other oppressions as its central focus, UU will be putting too much focus on identity groups. The concern is that constantly seeing fellow members through the lens of our separate identity groups will just divide us, not unite us. Making the dominant white identity group answerable to non-dominant identity groups is not the right answer. Think back to the definition of internalized racism. Many BIPOC are not going to appreciate being challenged by fellow BIPOC for To be blunt, doing things like white people do them. Having identity groups judge each other would almost certainly lead to tension and divisiveness. It would alienate many current and potential UU members and fracture, not build, a beloved community. Those are 10 solid reasons that it's justifiable to not adopt the proposed eighth principle. It is okay to vote no, explaining that I approve of most of the goals, but not this solution. It is also okay, arguably essential, to resist the stifling of dissenting voices. The ends do not justify the means. Deeper discussions are needed. Changes of this magnitude require a deep and open discussion in every congregation. Most congregations are not having this discussion because the wording of the proposed eighth principle is so ambiguous. Many congregations have already adopted the proposed eighth principle for themselves. The assumptions these congregations made may turn out to be off the mark. And it's going to be very hard for those congregations to reopen debate to evaluate the proposed eighth principle in the context of centralized authority and centralized accountability when the revised bylaws are revealed. UU members and congregations should not be making an accountable commitment based on assumptions. Approving the proposed eighth principle without clearer definitions and just hoping for the best is an abdication of our responsibility to be caretakers of UU. There is too much at stake. We need more clarity. I'm going to quickly scroll through 5 pages of references on the screen. The viewer can pause to review them if they desire. Here's page 2 of the references, page 3, page 4, and page 5 of references. Here I list the 3 main websites where I found most of those references. Here I list 5 books that I found very enlightening and helped clarify what is happening in UU. This is the end of the critique of the proposed eighth principle of Unitarian Universalism. I hope you find it helpful.